By the spring of 1945, the Second World War in Europe had reached its violent and chaotic conclusion. The Third Reich, once projected as a thousand-year empire, had collapsed in barely 12. Across a shattered continent, victorious armies pushed forward through landscapes scarred by mechanized destruction. Yet as the fighting ended, a new reality emerged, one that was far more complicated than simple triumph or defeat. The end of the war created winners, but it also left behind millions who would live with the consequences of victory and loss for generations. The color footage of these final weeks reveals not only the battlefield's devastation, but also the deeply human aftermath of global conflict, where relief, vengeance, hope, and despair all existed side by side. Berlin, the symbolic heart of Nazi Germany, Soviet troops raised the red banner above the Reichstag after days of brutal street-to-street combat. The city itself had become a graveyard of buildings and dreams. Color film from Soviet war correspondents captures the eerie stillness that followed the battle. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to skeletal ruins. Rubble covered the streets like waves frozen in time. Smoke still rose from shattered government ministries and residential blocks alike. Civilians wandered cautiously through the destruction, carrying salvaged belongings or searching desperately for missing family members. For many Germans, the fall of Berlin represented not just military defeat, but the collapse of a national identity shaped by years of propaganda, militarism, and dictatorship. The Soviet Union emerged from the war as one of its undeniable victors, but the price it paid was almost unimaginable. Soviet armies had borne the brunt of the fighting against Nazi Germany, suffering tens of millions of casualties. Color footage from the Eastern Front shows Red Army soldiers standing exhausted yet triumphant amid the ruins of German cities. Their uniforms were often worn and patched, their faces hardened by years of relentless warfare. Many soldiers carried the memory of burned villages, murdered civilians, and mass graves discovered as they advanced westward. Their victory was driven as much by vengeance and survival as by ideology or patriotism. As Soviet troops occupied Eastern Europe, their presence signaled both liberation from Nazi rule and the beginning of a new political order that would reshape the continent. For the Western Allies, primarily the United States, Britain, Canada, and their partners, the war's end brought both celebration and heavy responsibility. Color film from Paris, London, and New York shows crowds flooding the streets in spontaneous celebrations. Flags waved, church bells rang, and strangers embraced in emotional displays of relief. After years of rationing, air raids, and casualty lists, victory in Europe represented the end of a nightmare. Yet Allied soldiers on the ground in Germany experienced a far more complex reality. As they moved through defeated territory, they encountered concentration camps, forced labor facilities, and evidence of crimes that shocked even hardened veterans. Footage from camps such as Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen reveals scenes that defied comprehension. Survivors, reduced to skeletal figures, stared silently into the camera as they were liberated. Many were too weak to celebrate their freedom. Allied medics and soldiers struggled to provide emergency care, but disease and starvation had already taken an enormous toll. The discovery of these camps transformed the narrative of the war. It was no longer simply a struggle between nations or ideologies. It became a moral reckoning with the horrors of genocide. The visual evidence captured in color forced the world to confront the full scale of Nazi crimes. Meanwhile, across Eastern Europe, liberation brought its own set of contradictions. Nations such as Poland, Hungary, Romania, and Czechoslovakia were freed from German occupation, but many soon found themselves under Soviet influence or direct control. Color footage from cities like Warsaw shows devastated streets slowly filling with returning civilians. Families searched for homes that no longer existed. Governments attempted to rebuild national institutions while navigating the growing power of Soviet-backed political movements. For many citizens, the end of Nazi rule did not mean the return of independence, but rather the beginning of another uncertain chapter. Germany itself became a nation divided both physically and psychologically. Allied forces partitioned the country into occupation zones, each controlled by one of the victorious powers. Color film from American and British zones shows soldiers distributing food to starving civilians, supervising the removal of Nazi symbols, and overseeing the rebuilding of basic infrastructure. Children, many orphaned or displaced, gathered around military vehicles hopping for chocolate or canned rations. For the average German citizen, survival became the immediate priority. Entire cities faced food shortages, homelessness, and the collapse of public services. Denazification became one of the Allies' most challenging tasks. Former Nazi officials, military officers, and collaborators were arrested and interrogated. Trials were organized to determine responsibility for war crimes. Color footage from Nuremberg captures the solemn atmosphere of the tribunal, where leading figures of the Nazi regime stood before international judges. The trials sought to establish accountability, but they also revealed the vast scale of complicity within the regime. Many Germans claimed ignorance of the Holocaust and other atrocities, while prosecutors presented documentary evidence and witness testimony that painted a devastating picture of systematic brutality. For displaced persons across Europe, the end of the war marked the beginning of a long and uncertain journey home, or toward an entirely new life. Millions of prisoners of war, forced laborers, and refugees moved across the continent in massive, chaotic migrations. Color film shows endless columns of people walking along roads carrying suitcases, carts, or whatever possessions they could salvage. Allied authorities established temporary camps to house these populations, but resources were limited. Some refugees returned to find their homes destroyed or occupied by others. Others faced persecution in their homelands due to ethnic or political tensions intensified by the war. The Jewish survivors of the Holocaust faced particularly devastating realities. Many had lost entire families and communities. Color footage from displaced persons camps reveal survivors attempting to rebuild cultural and religious life while awaiting resettlement. International organizations struggled to provide food, shelter, and medical care. For many survivors, returning to pre-war homes in Eastern Europe proved dangerous due to lingering antisemitism and social instability. These experiences would eventually contribute to the global movement that led to the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. While Europe struggled to recover, the global balance of power shifted dramatically. The United States emerged as an economic and military superpower, possessing vast industrial capacity and the atomic bomb, which would soon reshape global warfare. Color footage from American factories transitioning from wartime production to consumer goods illustrates the country's rapid return to peacetime prosperity. Soldiers returned home to parades and celebrations, yet many carried psychological scars that would remain largely unrecognized at the time. The British Empire, though victorious, emerged from the war financially weakened and politically strained. Color film from London shows both jubilant crowds celebrating victory and neighborhoods still scarred by bomb damage. Britain faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding its economy while maintaining its global empire. The war had accelerated independence movements in colonies across Asia and Africa, signaling the beginning of decolonization. Within a few years, the empire that had once dominated global trade and politics would begin to dissolve. France, liberated after years of occupation, experienced a wave of national pride and internal reckoning. Color footage from liberated towns shows emotional reunions between civilians and returning French soldiers. However, the aftermath also included purges against suspected collaborators. Public humiliations, arrests, and executions occurred as communities sought to punish those accused of aiding German forces. France's political landscape would undergo major restructuring as it attempted to restore democratic institutions and rebuild national unity. Italy faced its own complicated transformation. After the fall of Mussolini and the country's surrender in 1943, Italy had become both a battlefield and a divided society. Color footage from Rome and northern cities shows a nation struggling to redefine itself. The monarchy would soon be abolished, and Italy would become a republic. Like Germany, Italy confronted the legacy of fascism while attempting to rebuild its economy and infrastructure. Across Asia, although the European War had ended, conflict continued against Imperial Japan. The experiences of Allied troops in Europe shaped their expectations for the final stages of the global conflict. Color footage from European victory celebrations contrasts sharply with the ongoing battles in the Pacific, reminding viewers that World War II remained unfinished on a global scale. When Japan eventually surrendered in August 1945, following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the world finally entered a fragile and uncertain peace. For soldiers returning home, reintegration into civilian life proved challenging. Color film shows veterans attending reunions, marrying, starting families, and seeking employment. Yet beneath these hopeful images were the invisible wounds of war. Many veterans struggled with trauma, survivor's guilt, and difficulty adjusting to peacetime society. At the time, psychological injuries were poorly understood and often ignored, leaving countless veterans to cope in silence. Women who had entered industrial workforces during the war faced a complex transition as well. Color footage from factories shows female workers assembling aircraft, vehicles, and munitions. As soldiers returned, many women were encouraged, or forced, to leave these jobs and return to domestic roles. The war, however, had permanently changed societal expectations and would later influence movements for gender equality across the Western world. The environmental devastation left by the war was staggering. Entire forests had been destroyed by bombing and artillery fire. Agricultural land across Eastern Europe and Germany was scarred by trenches, minefields, and tank battles. Color aerial footage reveals vast areas of farmland rendered unusable, contributing to food shortages that persisted for years after the war. Reconstruction required enormous resources and international cooperation. One of the most significant outcomes of the war was the creation of new international institutions aimed at preventing future global conflict. In 1945, representatives from dozens of nations gathered to form the United Nations. Color film from the founding conference captures delegates signing charters and delivering speeches filled with hope for lasting peace. The organization sought to provide a forum for diplomacy, humanitarian aid, and conflict resolution, though its effectiveness would be tested repeatedly during the Cold War. As the war faded into history, memory and representation became powerful forces in shaping how societies understood the conflict. Color footage, in particular, transformed public perception. Unlike black and white film, color created a sense of immediacy that made the war feel closer and more personal. Viewers could see the true hues of uniforms, landscapes, and human faces. This visual realism forced later generations to confront the war not as distant history, but as lived experience. For the defeated nations, the path forward involved confronting guilt, rebuilding economies, and redefining national identities. West Germany would eventually emerge as a democratic and prosperous state, while East Germany would exist under Soviet influence until the Cold War's end. Japan, similarly devastated by war, would undergo rapid reconstruction and become a major economic power within decades. These transformations demonstrated both the resilience of societies and the complex influence of occupation and international cooperation. Despite the celebrations of victory, the end of World War II did not bring universal peace. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new global rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. Color footage from post-war Europe shows the gradual emergence of ideological divisions, military alliances, and political tensions that would define the Cold War. Former allies became adversaries, and the continent that had just emerged from devastating conflict would soon face decades of political confrontation. The human cost of the war remained its most enduring legacy. Tens of millions were dead, entire cultures had been disrupted, and families across the world carried memories of loss. Memorials and cemeteries began to appear across Europe and beyond. Color film from military burial ceremonies captures rows of white crosses and Star of David markers stretching across green fields. These silent landscapes serve as permanent reminders of the scale of sacrifice that defined the conflict. Ultimately, the winners and vanquished of World War II were bound together by the shared experience of unprecedented destruction. Victory brought freedom and opportunity for many nations, but it also created new divisions and responsibilities. Defeat forced societies to confront their past while struggling to rebuild their futures. The war's end was not a simple conclusion, but a transformation that reshaped global politics, economics, and culture for generations. The color images that survive from this period allow modern audiences to witness the transition from war to peace with extraordinary clarity. They reveal the joy of liberation, the bitterness of defeat, and the resilience of ordinary people determined to rebuild their lives. Through these visual records, the final chapter of the war reminds us that history is not defined solely by battles and treaties, but by the millions of human stories that continue long after the guns fall silent. By the summer of 1945, Europe had entered a strange and fragile calm. The roar of artillery and the thunder of bombing raids had faded, replaced by the sounds of reconstruction, mourning, and uneasy political negotiation. Across the continent, color footage reveals cities attempting to breathe again after years of suffocation under total war. In Germany, entire urban centers such as Dresden, Hamburg, Cologne, and Berlin lay in ruins. Smoke-blackened cathedral towers rose above flat neighborhoods, while rail lines twisted across bomb craters like broken veins. Civilians moved through these shattered landscapes with carts and wheelbarrows, scavenging bricks and timber in desperate attempts to rebuild homes. For many Germans, daily survival depended on bartering, scavenging, and forming communal kitchens. The defeat of the Nazi regime had ended the war, but it left behind a society on the brink of humanitarian collapse. The Allied occupation forces quickly recognized that Germany's recovery was essential not only for humanitarian reasons, but also for long-term political stability. American and British administrators focused on restoring basic services such as electricity, sanitation, and food distribution. Color film from American-controlled zones shows military trucks delivering flour, powdered milk, and canned goods to starving populations. Allied soldiers often found themselves performing roles far removed from combat, acting as police officers, engineers, teachers, and relief workers. They supervised the reopening of schools and local governments, hoping to lay the groundwork for democratic institutions. However, shortages remained severe, and black markets flourished in nearly every major city. In the Soviet occupation zone, reconstruction followed a different path. Soviet authorities dismantled large sections of German industrial infrastructure, transporting machinery and equipment back to the Soviet Union as reparations. Color footage from eastern Germany shows factories stripped bare, assembly lines silent, and workers uncertain about their future. The Soviets also encouraged the formation of socialist political organizations, establishing the foundation for what would eventually become the German Democratic Republic. For many civilians, the contrast between Soviet and Western occupation policies became immediately visible, foreshadowing the ideological divide that would soon split Germany and Europe into opposing spheres of influence. Meanwhile, across Eastern Europe, the Red Army remained a dominant force shaping post-war governments. In Poland, cities like Warsaw had been almost entirely destroyed during the war. Color images show citizens clearing rubble by hand, forming human chains to remove debris from streets and public squares. The Polish government, supported by Soviet influence, attempted to rebuild the nation while dealing with deep political divisions between communist and nationalist factions. The boundaries of Poland itself had shifted westward, displacing millions of ethnic Germans who fled or were expelled from territories reassigned after the war. These massive population transfers, captured in haunting color footage, show endless trains and refugee columns stretching across the countryside, symbolizing one of the largest forced migrations in modern history. In Czechoslovakia and Hungary, liberation quickly evolved into political transformation. Communist parties, supported by Soviet authority, gained power through a combination of popular support, political pressure, and strategic alliances. Color film from Prague and Budapest shows public rallies celebrating liberation while simultaneously revealing the growing presence of Soviet military patrols. For many citizens, the joy of Nazi defeat was overshadowed by concerns about national sovereignty. These developments marked the early stages of the Cold War, as Eastern Europe gradually fell under Soviet political and military influence. The Balkan region faced its own complicated aftermath. Yugoslavia, under the leadership of Josip Broz Tito, emerged as a communist state independent from direct Soviet control. Color footage from Belgrade shows partisan fighters transitioning from guerrilla warfare to national governance. Tito's government focused on rebuilding infrastructure, while promoting a unified Yugoslav identity among diverse ethnic groups. However, the scars of wartime massacres and civil conflict remained deeply embedded within society, tensions that would resurface decades later. Across Western Europe, reconstruction began with enormous urgency. France launched extensive rebuilding projects, restoring transportation networks and industrial production. Color film from Marseille, Lyon, and Paris shows construction crews working around the clock to repair bridges, railways, and housing complexes. The French government also initiated economic reforms designed to modernize industry and prevent future economic collapse. Public morale was strengthened by the return of prisoners of war and deported laborers, many of whom arrived home physically weakened but determined to rebuild their lives. Italy faced similar challenges. Northern Italy, which had endured fierce battles between German forces, Allied armies, and Italian partisans, was particularly devastated. Color footage from Milan and Turin shows factories reopening while workers cleared bomb damage from industrial plants. The Italian political system underwent a dramatic transformation as the monarchy was abolished and a republican government established. Italians grappled with the legacy of fascism while attempting to stabilize their economy and political institutions. The Netherlands and Belgium, both heavily damaged by occupation and warfare, focused on rebuilding trade networks and repairing flood defenses destroyed during military operations. Color aerial film from Rotterdam reveals entire districts reconstructed in modern architectural styles, symbolizing both recovery and a break from the past. Meanwhile, Scandinavian countries such as Norway and Denmark, though less physically destroyed, worked to rebuild political and economic systems disrupted by years of occupation. The humanitarian crisis created by displaced populations remained one of the greatest challenges of the post-war period. Allied forces established displaced persons camps throughout Germany, Austria, and Italy. Color footage from these camps shows rows of temporary barracks housing survivors from across Europe. Families searched for missing relatives through Red Cross registries and community notice boards. Many refugees faced painful decisions about whether to return to their homelands or seek resettlement in countries such as the United States, Canada, Australia, or Palestine. Holocaust survivors carried particularly profound trauma. Color film from survivor gatherings shows attempts to restore cultural traditions through religious ceremonies, language schools, and artistic performances. Despite these efforts, many survivors struggled with grief, illness, and uncertainty about the future. International debates intensified regarding Jewish resettlement, eventually contributing to the establishment of Israel. The creation of the new state would reshape global politics and trigger further conflict in the Middle East, demonstrating how the war's consequences extended far beyond Europe. In the United States, the transition from war to peace sparked an economic boom. Color footage from American cities shows factories shifting from tank and aircraft production to automobiles, household appliances, and consumer goods. Returning soldiers benefited from government programs such as the GI Bill, which provided education and housing opportunities. Suburban neighborhoods expanded rapidly as veterans started families and pursued careers. Yet the American victory also ushered in new global responsibilities. The United States took a leading role in rebuilding Europe through financial aid programs that would soon culminate in the Marshall Plan, designed to stabilize economies and prevent the spread of communism. Britain, although victorious, faced severe economic strain. Color footage from post-war London reveals ration lines continuing years after the war ended. The British government introduced sweeping social reforms, including the creation of the National Health Service, aimed at improving public welfare and strengthening national unity. However, Britain's global empire began to unravel. Independence movements intensified in India, Southeast Asia, and Africa, marking the beginning of decolonization and reshaping global geopolitics. Japan's surrender in August 1945 brought the global conflict to a final close, but it also introduced new moral and strategic questions. Color footage from Hiroshima and Nagasaki shows cities reduced to ash and twisted steel following the atomic bombings. The scale of destruction shocked the world and demonstrated the terrifying potential of nuclear warfare. Under American occupation, Japan underwent sweeping political, economic, and social reforms. The country adopted a pacifist constitution, restructured its government, and focused on industrial modernization. Within decades, Japan would emerge as a major economic power, reflecting both resilience and the transformative influence of occupation policies. The emergence of nuclear weapons permanently altered the nature of global conflict. Color film from early atomic test sites shows mushroom clouds rising above remote deserts and islands, symbolizing humanity's entry into the nuclear age. The United States and Soviet Union quickly recognized that future wars could threaten the survival of civilization itself. This realization shaped the strategies, alliances, and tensions of the Cold War, a conflict defined by political rivalry, espionage, and proxy wars, rather than direct military confrontation between superpowers. International cooperation became a central theme of the post-war world. The United Nations, formed in 1945, sought to prevent future global conflicts through diplomacy and collective security. Color footage from early UN assemblies shows representatives from newly independent nations sitting alongside established global powers. The organization launched humanitarian programs, refugee assistance efforts, and peacekeeping missions, reflecting the international community's desire to avoid repeating the catastrophic mistakes that led to World War II. Culturally, the war left a profound impact on art, literature, and cinema. Color footage from post-war film studios shows directors and writers exploring themes of trauma, heroism, and moral responsibility. War memoirs, novels, and documentaries shaped public memory, influencing how future generations would understand the conflict. The preservation and restoration of color wartime footage played a crucial role in this process, providing vivid visual testimony that connected audiences directly to historical events. Despite reconstruction and economic growth, the psychological legacy of the war lingered across all nations involved. Veterans struggled with trauma that was often misunderstood or ignored. Survivors of bombings and occupation carried memories of loss that shaped families and communities for decades. Color film from post-war hospitals and rehabilitation centers reveals early attempts to address physical and psychological injuries, though comprehensive understanding of post-traumatic stress would not emerge until much later. The war also accelerated technological and scientific advancement. Radar, jet engines, medical antibiotics, and early computing systems developed during wartime research quickly found civilian applications. Color footage from laboratories and industrial plants shows scientists adapting military innovations for commercial use, contributing to rapid technological growth during the mid-20th century. These developments transformed transportation, communication, and medicine, reshaping daily life across the world. The legacy of World War II also reshaped global attitudes toward human rights. The revelations of the Holocaust and other wartime atrocities prompted international agreements designed to prevent genocide and protect civilian populations. The Nuremberg trials established legal precedents for prosecuting war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Color footage from courtroom proceedings captures the solemn determination of prosecutors and judges, attempting to establish a new framework for international justice. As the late 1940s progressed, the division of Europe became increasingly formalized. The Iron Curtain, a term popularized by Winston Churchill, symbolized the political and military boundary separating Western democracies from Soviet-controlled Eastern Europe. Color footage from Berlin shows the city gradually transforming into a focal point of Cold War tensions. Allied and Soviet troops operated within distinct sectors, while civilians navigated a city divided by ideology and occupation policies. These tensions would eventually culminate in events such as the Berlin Airlift and the construction of the Berlin Wall, demonstrating that the war's conclusion had merely evolved into a new global confrontation. Even as political tensions rose, ordinary people across Europe and Asia focused on rebuilding families, communities, and cultural traditions. Color footage from village festivals, reopened schools, and reconstructed churches illustrates humanity's resilience. Weddings, sports competitions, and public celebrations returned, symbolizing the gradual restoration of normal life. These everyday moments reveal that while nations debated political futures, individuals concentrated on survival, recovery, and hope. The end of the war in color ultimately reveals a world caught between devastation and renewal. The winners celebrated victory, but faced enormous responsibilities in rebuilding shattered societies and preventing future conflict. The vanquished confronted the consequences of political extremism and military defeat while struggling to redefine national identities. Both groups carried the scars of a conflict that had reshaped the modern world in irreversible ways. Through the lens of color film, the final chapter of World War II becomes more than a historical narrative. It becomes a vivid reminder of humanity's capacity for both destruction and recovery. The images capture triumph and tragedy, resilience and ruin, and the fragile hope that emerged from the ashes of global war. Say continue Part 5, and I will keep expanding toward the full 20,000-word documentary script, including deeper sections on Cold War beginnings, global power shifts, personal survivor stories, and long-term historical consequences. As the late 1940s unfolded, the meaning of victory and defeat continued to evolve in ways few had anticipated during the final days of fighting. The immediate aftermath of war had been dominated by survival and reconstruction, but now deeper questions emerged, questions about responsibility, memory, justice, and the future shape of the world. Color footage from this period captures a striking contrast: children playing amid ruins, soldiers sharing cigarettes with former enemies, and political leaders negotiating the fate of continents. The war had ended, but its shadow stretched long and dark across every aspect of post-war life. One of the most profound challenges facing the victorious powers was how to remember the war itself. In many countries, Official narratives emphasized heroism, sacrifice, and liberation. Color films produced in the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union celebrated military victories and national resilience. Parade footage showed veterans marching beneath banners and flags, cheered by crowds eager to honor their service. Yet beneath these triumphant images lay uncomfortable truths: strategic bombing campaigns that devastated civilian populations, forced population transfers, and moral compromises made in the name of victory. Memory became a battleground, shaped as much by politics as by historical fact. In Germany, the struggle over memory was particularly intense. Color footage from post-war classrooms shows teachers attempting to explain recent history to children who had grown up under Nazi indoctrination. Textbooks were rewritten, symbols removed, and public discussions encouraged, though often cautiously. Many Germans preferred silence, focusing on rebuilding rather than confronting the past. Others, particularly younger generations, began to question how their society had allowed such crimes to occur. This tension between forgetting and remembering would shape German identity for decades, influencing everything from education to foreign policy. In the Soviet Union, victory became a cornerstone of national identity. Color footage from Victory Day celebrations in Moscow shows massive military parades, banners bearing portraits of fallen heroes, and crowds honoring the Red Army's role in defeating Nazi Germany. The war was portrayed as a unifying struggle of survival against fascist invasion. Yet this narrative often obscured the immense human cost, including political purges, forced labor, and civilian suffering under Stalin's rule. Veterans returned home to a country that celebrated their sacrifice while offering limited support for their physical and psychological wounds. Across Eastern Europe, memory was shaped by shifting political realities. Governments aligned with the Soviet Union emphasized liberation from fascism, while downplaying or suppressing accounts of repression and loss that followed. Color footage from state-sponsored commemorations shows monuments erected to Red Army soldiers, often overshadowing local experiences of occupation. For many citizens, public memory diverged sharply from private memory, creating a culture of silence and unresolved trauma that persisted throughout the Cold War. In Western Europe, nations grappled with collaboration and resistance. France, in particular, promoted a narrative of widespread resistance against German occupation. Color films celebrated partisans and underground fighters, reinforcing national pride. Yet historians and survivors knew that collaboration had been widespread, and that many citizens had benefited, or simply survived, by accommodating the occupiers. The process of confronting these realities unfolded slowly, often painfully, as societies struggled to reconcile myth with truth. Justice remained a central concern. Beyond the Nuremberg trials, thousands of smaller trials took place across Europe. Color footage from courtrooms shows defendants ranging from high-ranking officials to local collaborators. These proceedings aimed to establish accountability, but they also revealed the difficulty of assigning guilt in a system where millions had participated in or tolerated crimes. Some perpetrators escaped punishment entirely, blending back into civilian life. Others were prosecuted decades later, reopening wounds and sparking renewed debates about responsibility and forgiveness. The fate of prisoners of war further complicated the post-war landscape. Millions of German soldiers returned home from captivity in the West relatively quickly, while those held in the Soviet Union often endured years of forced labor. Color footage from repatriation camps shows gaunt men stepping off trains, greeted by families who barely recognized them. These returning soldiers carried not only physical exhaustion, but also the burden of defeat and uncertainty about their place in a transformed society. For Allied soldiers, victory did not erase the memories of violence. Color film from veterans' hospitals in the United States and Britain shows men undergoing rehabilitation for amputations, burns, and neurological injuries. Many suffered from nightmares, anxiety, and emotional numbness, conditions that were rarely discussed openly. Society expected them to resume normal lives, marry, work, and raise families, often without acknowledging the psychological toll of years spent in combat. The war also reshaped family structures. Millions of women had become widows, single mothers, or primary breadwinners. Color footage from post-war households shows women balancing domestic responsibilities with paid labor, particularly in Europe's devastated economies. Although many were encouraged to return to traditional roles, their wartime experiences had expanded expectations and capabilities. These changes planted the seeds for later social movements that would challenge established gender norms. Children who grew up during the war carried unique scars. Color footage from orphanages and refugee camps shows young faces marked by loss and resilience. Many had witnessed violence, endured hunger, or been separated from parents for years. Governments and humanitarian organizations struggled to provide education and stability. Recognizing that this generation would shape the post-war world, their experiences influenced attitudes toward peace, nationalism, and international cooperation in the decades that followed. Economically, the contrast between winners and vanquished became increasingly visible. The Marshall Plan, launched by the United States in 1947, provided massive financial assistance to Western European nations. Color footage from ports and rail yards shows shipments of machinery, fuel, and food arriving across the continent. This aid accelerated recovery, stabilized currencies, and strengthened democratic institutions. In contrast, Eastern Europe followed a different economic model, emphasizing state control and centralized planning under Soviet influence. These divergent paths deepened the division between East and West. Germany became the most striking symbol of this divide. Color film from the late 1940s shows West German cities rapidly rebuilding with modern architecture, bustling markets, and growing industrial output. In East Germany, reconstruction proceeded more slowly, shaped by socialist planning and resource extraction. The contrast in living standards became increasingly apparent, fueling political tension and migration. Berlin, divided into sectors, stood as a microcosm of the emerging Cold War. Globally, the end of the war accelerated the decline of European imperial power. In Asia, independence movements gained momentum. Color footage from India shows massive crowds celebrating independence in 1947, marking the end of British colonial rule. Similar movements emerged across Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. Former colonial powers, weakened by war, struggled to maintain control. The global map began to change rapidly, with new nations emerging from the ruins of empire. In the Middle East, the post-war period brought both hope and conflict. The creation of Israel in 1948, influenced in part by the Holocaust and displaced Jewish populations, reshaped regional politics. Color footage from early Israeli settlements shows refugees building homes and communities under difficult conditions. At the same time, the displacement of Palestinian Arabs sparked enduring conflict, illustrating how the war's legacy continued to generate new struggles rather than lasting peace. The war also transformed science and medicine. Advances developed under wartime pressure, such as antibiotics, blood transfusion techniques, and reconstructive surgery, saved countless lives in peacetime. Color footage from hospitals shows doctors applying these innovations to civilian care. Survivors of war injuries benefited from prosthetics and rehabilitation methods that had evolved rapidly during the conflict. These medical advances became part of the war's complex legacy, blending destruction with progress. Culturally, societies sought ways to process collective trauma. Memorials were erected in town squares and cemeteries. Color footage from unveiling ceremonies shows mourners standing in silence, names of the dead etched into stone. Literature, film, and art grappled with themes of loss, guilt, and moral ambiguity. war films moved beyond simple heroism, exploring the psychological cost of combat and the suffering of civilians. These cultural expressions shaped how future generations understood the conflict. Religion also played a role in post-war reflection. Color footage from churches, synagogues, and other places of worship shows services dedicated to mourning and thanksgiving. Faith offered comfort to many, while others questioned long-held beliefs in the face of immense suffering. Religious institutions became involved in humanitarian relief and reconciliation efforts, attempting to heal divisions left by war and genocide. As the Cold War intensified, former allies increasingly viewed each other with suspicion. Color footage from military exercises and diplomatic meetings reveals a world preparing for potential conflict even as it sought to avoid another global war. Nuclear weapons cast a long shadow, influencing political decisions and public consciousness. Civil defense drills, air raid shelters, and propaganda campaigns reminded civilians that peace remained fragile. Yet amid these tensions, international cooperation persisted. Scientific exchanges, cultural programs, and humanitarian initiatives crossed ideological boundaries. Color film from student exchanges and international conferences shows young people engaging with peers from former enemy nations. These interactions reflected a desire to prevent future conflict through understanding and collaboration, even as political divisions hardened. The winners of World War II found themselves burdened by leadership and responsibility. Victory demanded reconstruction, diplomacy, and vigilance against new threats. The vanquished faced the challenge of rebuilding trust, redefining identity, and confronting the moral consequences of defeat. In many cases, the lines between winner and loser blurred, as suffering and sacrifice had touched nearly every nation involved. Ultimately, the end of the war in color reveals a truth often lost in simple narratives of triumph and defeat. The war reshaped humanity in profound ways, altering political systems, social structures, and individual lives. Its conclusion marked not an ending, but a transformation, one that continues to influence the modern world. Through the vivid realism of color footage, the final chapter of World War II becomes deeply human. Faces emerge from history not as abstract symbols, but as individuals navigating loss, hope, and uncertainty. The winners and the vanquished alike carried forward the lessons and burdens of the war, shaping a world determined, yet never guaranteed, to avoid repeating the horrors of the past.